Okay,
Go
folks,
ahead.
we're going to get started. We're trying to figure out the pathable interface here. We're thrilled that you're joining us for this webinar, applying the PBIS framework to the growing problem of domestic sex trafficking among minors. And so we've got two wonderful presenters with us today. Nakisa Asethnia from our program here at the University of South Carolina, Clinical Community Psychology, and Jordan Brantley from the Greenville Mental Health Center, working in the school mental health program there. I'm going to be your facilitator and content manager, so I'm going to help with the Q&A and all of that. And I believe we have some polls built in. Nakisa, would you pull up the slides?
Sure, we'll take a stab at that. Hopefully technology is on our side. Let me see. Awesome. Are we seeing my kind of main title slide here?
Yes, we are.
Awesome. Perfect. And I think, yeah, my screen's fully taken up by the presentation, but I can at least see the other presenters. So if you guys need anything, let me know.
All right. You can just go through these early slides, Nakisa. I think folks have hopefully been in the forum so far, and you've been through some of these slides.
Slowly clicking.
And I'll turn it over to Nakisa here. I'll just say that this is such an important topic. There are very few examples of applying the PBIS framework to this issue. But we think this is so important. We know the problem is increasing. So we're going to cover kind of the landscape in terms of knowledge. And there is a practice brief that we developed and posted on the PBIS website in 2020. So we'll hear from Nakisa, who is the lead author on that practice brief, providing kind of the general background and the issue and how to apply the PBIS framework to help address the issue. And then we'll hear from Jordan on some experiences in Greenville, South Carolina with human trafficking. And then we'll have about 15 minutes at the end for some Q&A. So I'll turn it over to Nakisa here.
Wonderful. And I'll be moving my head back and forth a little bit. I have a dual display here, so people know where I'm looking. So I did want to touch on our broader learning objectives to kind of orient everyone to the presentation. The first goal is to provide a broader understanding of domestic human trafficking and how to spot red flags. This is pretty broadly useful for all individuals in society, but particularly if you work in youth-serving sectors, it can be helpful to have a general sense of what domestic human trafficking actually looks like, and maybe what some of those more under the radar red flags might be. The second learning objective here is understanding how human trafficking prevention framework could be integrated into a PBIS model. We'll briefly touch on PBIS. Obviously, you're here at the PBIS forum, so you have a general sense of what it is, but it's a great model that would kind of integrate well with the human trafficking frame. And the third is to consider resources in your own settings that would allow for PBIS or a three-tiered approach. And before we continue, I did want to provide a brief trigger warning. The following presentation does include language and discussion of child abuse in the form of child sex trafficking specifically. It is for the purposes of education and prevention and intervention implementation. And the content isn't extremely graphic in nature, but the topic could be disturbing to some people. So if you are at any point feeling upset, feel free to pause or turn off speakers or step out of the room, whatever you feel comfortable doing, but we completely understand if that is the case. So as our first aim mentioned, we want to kind of provide a brief overview of domestic minor sex trafficking. We'll try not to throw around too many jargon words, but DMST is a pretty important one, so that is one to stick with. And before I provide you an overview, I was hoping to do a quick poll. You'll find your poll in Pathable. And if you could write words or ideas that you currently have about domestic minor sex trafficking or DMST. What is it? Who is affected? Pretty much anything that pops up for you. I'm going to try and open your poll over here as well to be able to engage with that. Yeah, so we see at least one word coming through for common. It should be coming up as a word cloud. So, and if you're not familiar, you go into the Pathable platform under chat. To the right of chat is polls. And when you see that, you'll be able to answer and enter questions there. So what comes to mind? We got common, which is great. It is, in fact, very common. Any words, ideas, preconceived notions anyone might have about DMST? And if my team sees things that I might be missing on Pathable, let me know. But right now it's looking, one word came through.
Nikisa, it says you need to share screen. It can't see slides. You are in presentation mode.
I see it right now. You're not able to see my slide where it says quick poll? Do I need to switch the display settings, possibly the presenter view in this?
Yeah, if any of I can see slides, they're small because you're in presentation mode. Is there another mode?
Did that help? Ooh. I switched it out.
Okay, yes, that helped it. That
Okay,
got
awesome.
it. Okay, thank you.
Thank
Awesome.
you. And let me get this over here so I can, awesome. So we're seeing a lot more things coming through. Thank you for whoever or Mark notified me of that. And I saw Hunter and Chattis as well. So in the Pathable poll, you guys should see a word cloud popping up. And it's changing, which is awesome, means you guys are engaging. Confusing, girls, discriminatory, LGBTQ. We see CSEC, which is we'll get into a little bit, but it is another term for child sex trafficking or exploitation of children. Cities, so yeah, location, even small towns. So those are really great points. Disturbing, I'm seeing no more. So possibly someone thinking, you know, it's not that prevalent, but then we do have other people noting that it's prevalent. So yeah, color of children. Yeah, we're seeing really great ideas. And these are really common thoughts that come up for people around domestic sex trafficking of minors. So for the sake of time, I'll move us forward a little bit. So what is DMST? So the commercial sexual exploitation of children occurs when a child is sexually abused for economic purposes. You saw someone wrote CSEC in the word clouds. In the United States, the term is synonymous for commercial sexual exploitation of children. For the purposes of our brief presentation, we stayed focused on calling it DMST, but they're both appropriate terms. And it's a label given to any case in which a child, any person under the age of 18, being a child born in the United States, being the domestic piece here, is involved in a commercial sex act. And that's where the economic purpose comes in of that brief definition you saw. A very important and notable act is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in 2000, is when it was initially passed. It's since had many iterations, which is really helpful as those iterations have added important pieces of information. So based on its very base definition, sex trafficking involves the recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, or obtaining a person under the age of 18 for sex. And the TVPA, which is the act we're discussing here, actually broadly includes all forms of human trafficking. So we'll be talking specifically about minor sex trafficking here, but this includes adult and child, as well as sex and labor trafficking. And so it's just notable that if you do look into the TVPA any further, that's kind of where the origins of this work comes from, but is broader than just children and sex trafficking. Next. So talking a little bit more about DMST, giving you a background here, the TVPA was reauthorized in 2013, specifically under the Violence Against Women Reauthorization. And the reason that this reauthorization is important is that this policy emphasizes a new multidimensional perspective on this definition. And that includes specific language regarding commercial sex acts committed against individuals under the age of 18, but it also incorporates individuals between 18 and 20 years old who were victimized while they were under the age of 18. So that means those individuals would still be viewed as victims of sex trafficking for children if the act occurred when they were under the age of 18, despite their current age. But that does cap between 18 and 20 years old. Some of the pathways to DMST. So the reason this is important is a lot of times we see Hollywood versions of what human trafficking is, in this case, what sex trafficking is. And it's important to characterize it by the actual ways in which we're seeing children and minors go into these commercial sex acts, and how is this being facilitated. So some of the main types of DMST are pimp controlled. That's one that people most frequently hear about, but in the context of adults. And so that's one to apply to children because it is occurring for them as well as familial and intimate partner based. So there are situations in which a family member or intimate partner is soliciting sex for a partner or a child or another family member. And so they are kind of facilitating the sex act occurring against the minor. And the other is gang involved. And often you'll see here, the way this is framed is that the pathways into trafficking are categorized based on their relationship of the trafficker to the victim. So that's why we have pimp here, familial, intimate partner. These are identifying how the trafficker is getting the victim into sex trafficking. And for some children or youth, like runaway and homeless youth, we saw LGBTQ come up in the word cloud. That is a really huge chunk of runaway and homeless youth, unfortunately. But more broadly than the LGBTQ population, runaway and homeless youth also sometimes engage in commercial sex act as a means of survival. So we call this survival sex in the field. And it's used in order to enable them to meet basic needs. So it's kind of a bartering system. But overall, minors may be engaged or forced to engage in a variety of transactional sex acts. Sometimes it's for shelter, food, money, love is a big one, or the illusion of love, or any other valued entity that might actually be a financial gain for the trafficker. So whatever mechanism is being used as a motivation is often transactional to some degree. So the long-term consequences of DMST, these are a few. Of course, it's pretty broad ranging and individually based as well, whether or not an individual is impacted. So there isn't one standard way someone is impacted by DMST, but some of the common ones are psychological traumatization, emotional and behavioral distress. There's numerous linked physical health consequences, as well as a range of psychosocial diagnoses. So these people have gone and gotten formal diagnoses from mental health professionals. That includes post-traumatic stress disorder, ADHD, depression, anxiety, and eating disorders. And then lastly, suicidal ideation and behavior, as well as substance abuse and social isolation, have also been linked to DMST involvement. So to give you a sense of the big picture, I think we saw in some cases people said it's really prevalent in the word cloud. In other cases, we saw not common, not happening much anymore. The big picture here is in the US, approximately 150,000 to 300,000 children are trafficked for commercial sexual exploitation every year. It's a pretty astronomical number compared to what people think. And the reality is we don't actually know the exact estimate. As you can imagine, many of these things are done kind of in the shadows. It's not something that's open, and in reporting it runs into the same challenges. So this is likely an underreporting of the actual estimates that are occurring each year. The second bubble here we have is that the sexual exploitation of children has become an enterprise that contributes to sex trafficking overall's $27.8 billion gross profit in the United States each year. So there is adult sex trafficking as well, and the sexual exploitation of children has added pretty strongly to this overall massive profit that's occurring each year. And so this is a huge motivator for traffickers. This potential for profit and substantial profit is a big driver for trafficking. So pivoting a little bit from the broader understanding of domestic trafficking, sex trafficking, we want to touch a little bit on school-based intervention and prevention of DMST. So why school-based? Kind of why have we focused on schools? The reason for that is school personnel's interaction with students every day puts them in a really prime position to look for signs of abuse or neglect, as well as common behaviors that accompany DMST, such as internalizing challenges, depression, anxiety, some externalizing things like anger, a child showing fear or being isolated from others would be really important red flags. And we'll touch on those in a little bit. And then school personnel continue to be the highest reporters of child abuse and neglect, according to the most recent published data by Department of Social Services. So they're already on the front lines doing a lot of that hard work in terms of abuse and neglect reporting. This is another tool they were hoping to add to their toolbox, is reporting on human trafficking and sex trafficking in minors. And overall, this data supports the notion that school personnel and staff and collaborating agencies that work with schools already have the skills they need, and willingness, they're doing this hard work, the willingness to be at the forefront of protecting children from these challenges. Staff are trained to look for these signs of distress. It's the same mentality where they're looking for broader child abuse and neglect. They're looking for signs of distress, and the overlap is pretty strong with victims of domestic sex trafficking in terms of those distress signals. And sometimes things could be mistaken for more singular form of physical abuse or sexual abuse, and the reality is it may actually be a commercial sex trafficking situation. Touching a little bit more on why school-based, the average age of recruitment for DMST is actually between the ages of 12 and 14. So thinking specifically about who's at the most high risk, those ages would be pretty pivotal. And this means that schools are in a critical place to intervene and to fight DMST and the rise of DMST in the United States. Schools are the largest youth serving system and also serve often as lead agencies in a lot of community coalitions and collaborating across disciplines. So it really puts them in a prime position to address a multi-systemic issue in a multi-systemic way. Schools are also uniquely positioned to spearhead efforts and aid in the identification of risk factors and the implementation of intervention. We have a lot of skilled staff. We have a lot of people who are already primed. So bringing those two things together and doing an intervention or prevention techniques could be something that's more doable for a school rather than in a setting that isn't used to cross collaboration or implementation of programming. It's also better to engage schools in these urgent large-scale endeavors. There's schools everywhere, and the collaboration of larger school districts, which we'll hear a little bit from Jordan about later, is really pivotal. And then utilizing an evidence-based framework such as PBIS, one that's already established, already being implemented in a majority of schools, can help further promote that collaboration between schools and these youth-serving systems. So we won't dip into it too much, but you all are likely familiar with PBIS being a very evidence-based framework and being implemented in over 27,000 schools across the US. And so that's kind of the reason we felt this would be a really strong foundation for doing something, as Mark mentioned, has not been done particularly. There isn't a gold standard for intervention and prevention of DMST, and using schools and using PBIS seems like a really natural dovetail to meet the needs. So PBIS can be an advantageous evidence-based framework for schools to use. And the reasons for that are below. The first is that disclosure and help-seeking behaviors for vulnerable or victimized students may be more easily facilitated in a safe and supportive school climate that PBIS is already supporting. The second being the development of positive social, emotional, behavioral skills embedded in the PBIS framework could help to reduce the risk of exploitation for students. So some of those core skills are being built as a part of a PBIS model as it is, and those could be great protective factors for students who may be at risk. The third being the use of school and community data to inform teams of students who may be at risk, or already being victimized in DMST. And the last being the benefits of PBIS have already been documented in other youth serving systems such as juvenile justice. So it's imaginable this would be kind of a natural place to provide this intervention and prevention. So what does this dovetailing actually look like? We presented kind of explaining some background in DMST, some background on PBIS in schools and why DMST might be a fit, but how do these actually go together? So there are a few really important steps to take for any youth serving agency or organization prior to incorporating this three-tier model aimed at preventing and intervening with DMST. And these steps are really important because you'll find gaps in other places when an issue actually arises if these steps haven't been taken on the front end. The first is that schools would develop standardized policies and protocols for responding to youth who've experienced or are at risk of experiencing commercial sexual exploitation. So having an actual meeting where we sit down, we develop this protocol and procedure on the front end is really important rather than being responsive to something that's happening once it's happening. The second is being that schools and build or strengthen partnerships with other community members. So that includes outside service providers, local and federal law enforcement, local school boards, human trafficking task forces, and coalitions. And you'll be surprised to find a majority of cities have some sort of trafficking task force or coalition, often coming from attorney general's offices due to the TVPA and some of the legislation that promoted the creation of these task forces and coalitions. So you'll look in your local area, you'll probably find a government-run task force that includes other community providers. It's important to have relationship with child welfare agencies as well as juvenile justice agencies and runaway and homeless youth providers. The reason for that, I'm sure as many of you know, is those are really high-risk populations, the high-risk kiddos. There's a pretty strong overlap of juvenile justice and child welfare involvement in the literature with regard to human trafficking and child sex trafficking. And so we're seeing a lot of overlap in these major systems and those same kids going to school, going in and out of school systems. So developing school policy and procedure, what does it mean? That's kind of that initial must-have to be able to have a successful program. This is a multi-tier process. It starts with educating staff on risk factors and indicators of sex trafficking, educating parents and students similarly about the risks of sex trafficking. It may seem like something that's not needed, but if you remember from the earlier slides, some ways in which children and students in this case are trafficked is through familial relationships or intimate partner relationships. So sometimes it's a boyfriend and sometimes it's parents or family members. It's not something that's always known to the other family members. So this education is really important regardless of where you are. It's something that's hugely preventative. It allows us to work as a team to do prevention and identify individuals who might be at risk in a kind of community-wide trauma lens. The tertiary point here being establishing a clear protocol for identifying possible victims and then a swift and appropriate response to disclosure from a suspected victim. So what exactly will happen? Having that really specifically detailed is very helpful. And then identifying a few school-specific personnel who are in this designated role. So if these issues arise, we know we have this trafficking DMST focused point person who not only is kind of up on these risk factors, is up on the protocols at that school, but is able to respond appropriately given the situation being much more sensitive and often dangerous for many people. So it's important that this person is identified, and it's helpful if this person can be someone who already has skills and ability in assessing for psychological and emotional disturbance. So often we suggest school psychologists, social workers, or any other individuals who is fairly attuned to some of those clinical soft skills that are needed, as well as assessment skills that will be needed for this protocol. Some questions to consider when building DMST protocols and procedures. This is more broadly, as you can see this, I put the source down here very specifically. The National Human Trafficking Resource Center is a really great resource, especially if you're trying to develop a protocol outside of a school. You're applying a lot of this knowledge to a different youth serving agency. Seeking out those types of resources and considering these questions is extremely important. So what are the state laws on human trafficking in my state? There are different task forces, there are different laws by state. So despite a federal mandate, as with everything else, there's some variation in prosecution and different things by state. Is there already another related protocol with parallel reporting steps that you could pull from or that exists in the community? So you don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel, and it could help with cross-system collaboration. What are the mandatory reporting obligations for various staff in my school? This is still a mandatory report. In most states, any school personnel are going to be mandatory reporters. And so it's just important to know what your state specifically looks like. And at what point do we then need to go ahead and follow through with the child welfare report and then continue to follow your school-based procedures. But it often comes down to doing that pretty early on in the process. Who's positioned to be a lead point of contact in human trafficking in my school? That comes back to identifying a specific point person. Who are school-based and or district-based protocol? Would a school-based or district-based protocol be more successful in my area? So perhaps you have a smaller area, if it's more rural, it might be more logical to have a district-based protocol. Multiple school representatives can come together and have kind of a standard protocol. In large metropolitan areas, that might not be as doable, in which case school-based would make most sense. What resources and referrals are available in my area for potential trafficking victims? Identifying those is important. That's really the wraparound service you're going to be able to provide when a victim is identified. So we need to be able to do some protection on the back end as well. And so knowing what resources are available specifically for this population is really important. And if you don't have resources available for that population, finding other populations that might be similarly served, like child welfare. Children who are coming out of child welfare might be able to use similar resources as children who have experienced trafficking. So just adjusting to the availability of resources in your community. What is my school's relationship with local and federal law enforcement? That's going to be pretty pivotal in terms of reporting human trafficking and ensuring the safety of not only your personnel, but of the child in question. And then what do I tell the students' parents? Having a script or some sort of thought out response ahead of time is really important. You don't want to be stuck in a situation where you're not really sure what the next step is, and then not being able to either communicate that to the child's parent or caregiver as well. As I mentioned, mandated reporting is pretty huge, and it's important to note that no protocol should serve as a substitute for mandated reporting. In addition to following mandated reporting procedures, you can also call the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline. If you Google that as a 1-888 number, but it's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they provide additional information regarding local victim services and can help you in the moment to assess the needs. But as long as your school already has a protocol in place, they can kind of support that further rather than having to give you all the answers in the moment. So looking at DMST in the PBIS framework, we've created kind of a mnemonic to hopefully help people remember, but DMST can be encapsulated by the 3 R's of DMST in schools. That's risk, recognize, and report. So the risk factors should be broadly understood, as we mentioned, by faculty, staff, parents, other students. Recognizing risk factors or indicators of trafficking, so being able to identify them in other children who may be at risk or are currently being trafficked. And then reporting to the appropriate school personnel. So there should be a standard steps that are followed where individuals know, oh, I go to this one person, or I go to the principal who triages this out. Whatever it looks like, there should be standard procedures so that all individuals of the school are aware of how they should handle a situation where they're concerned about the safety of a child. Okay, perfect. So the framework for integrating DMST into PBIS is broken, as you can imagine, to 3 tiers. The first tier, the green primary prevention tier, the bottom here being awareness and prevention. The secondary tier being assessment, identification, and targeted intervention. And the third tier being intensive intervention and reporting. This multi-tiered system of support does address both intervention and prevention, as you can see, rising up from the primary to the tertiary tiers. And it does take a broad approach. So it allows you to kind of screen out individuals who may be at risk for other things, but may not be actually in danger of DMST, in which case the school can follow other procedures. But making sure you're doing this very thoughtfully and thoroughly can help to be more broad in identifying students who may be at risk. So examining tier 1, awareness and prevention, what does this actually look like? So I've listed here some risk factors as well as some possible indicators, and noting the difference between those 2 columns is extremely important. So some risk factors include past sexual, physical, or emotional abuse, previous traumatic experiences, so individuals who are coming from one or multiple victimizations in their past or exhibiting active trauma symptoms may be at higher risk of victimization, an abusive, neglectful, or unstable home environment, poverty and or lack of stability in having basic needs met, such as food, shelter, clothing. If you're contextualizing some of this in who the trafficker might be in an abusive home, it could potentially be a family member or a caregiver. For example, with the second bullet, poverty or lacking stability, these are situations where transactional sex might be something that is more plausible. An individual has a need for something that they need to survive, and that survival sex piece would be important there. A history of homelessness or running away, poor self-image or self-esteem, history of truancy, delinquency, or criminal activity. And schools are pretty clear on truancy, at least, and have that data on hand. So that's one to definitely look for, is try and identify why the student might be missing so many days of class or absent from school for periods of time, and so consistently. Any developmental learning disabilities, lack of school engagement, gang affiliation, language barriers, or undocumented immigration status. Possible indicators might be physical trauma, emotional trauma, which often manifests as trauma symptoms, but it could also include sudden behavioral changes, such as depression or anxiety, fearfulness, staying in a hyper-aroused state. Another indicator could be malnourishment or inappropriate dress based on the surroundings and the environment. frequent episodes of running away, inconsistent ability to attend school or pay attention or complete coursework. Sometimes these students are identified as being more trouble students or students that need more educational intervention, but sometimes it's an environmental cause like DMST or an abusive home that's causing a lot of these difficulties. Presence of a noticeably older and or controlling boyfriend or girlfriend. Note these are in quotes, given the inappropriate relationship the individual is often having with the child, and we as a field don't feel comfortable officially calling them a boyfriend because that implies mutual romantic interest rather than a coercive or abusive situation, which is what a trafficker is doing. The inability to bond with others, overly attached behaviors, any tattoos displaying the name of the trafficker, so that might say daddy or something of the sort. Signs of drug addiction, rehearsed responses to questioning. It's a pretty big red flag. Traffickers are often looking for ways to calm the system and individuals who may be concerned. So if a child sounds like they're rehearsing a response to a question you're asking out of concern, that's a pretty big red flag regardless of trafficking, but broadly of trauma and victimization. So definitely one to keep an eye out for. And then lastly, another possible indicator is promiscuity and overly sexual references beyond kind of what you'd expect for their age group. And within all of this, professional development and ongoing coaching are core features of implementing PBIS in this first tier of the model. PBIS in this first tier. And given the estimated prevalence of DMST in all communities, providing school-based staff with trainings on these two topic areas and broadly is a really strong preliminary way to kind of address the growing concern. And then actually be able to do some prevention work aside from the intervention work that's needed at higher tiers. And then I was going to also make a side note that you'll notice a lot of youth who have experienced ACEs or adverse childhood experiences, such as foster care system involvement, being low SES. Those identifiers were in their risk factors. And so those individuals are often at very high risk, just given the instability of their lives already to date. In this tier 1 awareness and prevention, additional areas for expanding school-wide knowledge is kind of the key here. Staff, students, parents, we talked about that a little bit. But this also comes down to standard terminology. So it's often found that terms such as sex trafficking, commercial sexual exploitation in children, and DMST, which is the one we're using here, are unclear or unfamiliar to most people. Or as I said, sound like these big movie things that don't actually happen in our communities. So making sure your entire school or environment or district, depending on how you've shaped your protocols and procedures, are using the same terms and have the same general understanding of what it is we're talking about. So really clearly identifying terminology, but identifying this is the word we're going to use to apply to this. So like in our case, we clarified DMST is what we're using for clarity. And then having an awareness of recruitment techniques. So both internet facilitated and non-internet based recruitment techniques are pretty common among traffickers. As we've all noticed, generationally, internet use and access to internet has increased pretty rapidly. But that's not the only way that people are recruited into trafficking, especially with children. A lot of times we saw intimate partner. It could be a Romeo is what they call them, but it could be a boyfriend. It could be a partner. It could be a family member. So it doesn't always have to be the internet, although the internet is also an option. And then additional and known potential recruitment methods can be used in tandem or in isolation. So appealing to promises of a better life, angling to fulfill a relationship that's lacking or vulnerable in a youth's life. And that's kind of where we're seeing the false love or feigned affection. Meeting youth's basic needs, and that's kind of the survival we talked about earlier, food, shelter, clothing, providing employment, and then using peers or other victims to recruit the youth. This one's probably gonna have to do the same. Sorry, did someone say something?
Okay. No, you're good.
Okay. But using peers or other victims is actually a really common way. Individuals will be recruited themselves, be at the same school with a plethora of other students. And so traffickers see this as a really easy way to identify other potential victims of trafficking. And the last is using manipulations of sense of duty to help provide for others. And these are sometimes culturally based. So if you do live in an area where familial duty and sense of duty is a common value, then it's important to note that this might be an easy way to pull a child or an individual into trafficking. And then using shame and guilt, which are pretty strong motivators as well. So a lot of manipulations here. And a lot of times you'll see these recruitment techniques promoting unhealthy relationships between children and adults. Internet-based, that could be private chat rooms. But even this exploitation or enticement with finances and money, that's a pretty strong motivator for most young kids. Tier 1 recommendations and challenges. So for the recommendations, to kind of broadly give an overview, the first is to conduct school-wide awareness campaigns for all staff, students, and parents. The second is to teach all students healthy decision-making practices in regard to internet usage and healthy boundaries. The third is implementing interventions and increase positive relationships. And then lastly, the challenge would be addressing stigma associated with DMST and those implicit biases that we talked about, and shame associated with the youth who might be at risk. And for time purposes, I'm going to speed us up a little bit because I'm way over. I'm not going to read everything on these slides, but give you brief overviews of the second and third tiers. The second is assessment and identification. This is where that individual who's kind of already good at assessment, they're going to be needed a little bit in the second tier, but also in the third. In this second tier, the assessment could be informal and formal. It could be the typical check-in, check-out procedures that individuals might be using through PBIS. It could just be knowing risk factors and asking a few questions to assess the youth's safety, trying to get a sense of whether it's something that does need to be passed along in your protocol to the formal DMST person. But sometimes formal assessments are used. And so that's where you tap that person. And we have a list of written questionnaires that may be used to identify a student who may be at risk. Some of these assessments, the first chunk are assessments that could be used to capture at-risk status. So these are validated tools. The second are specifically for suspected or confirmed trafficking, such as the Trafficking Victimization Identification Tool. These lists are not exhaustive, but it's important to note that formal assessment tools should be chosen based on appropriate psychometric properties, and an individual who has assessment training in your facility should be able to inform that decision-making. Tier 1 recommendations and challenges, Tier 2 recommendations and challenges. With Tier 2 recommendations, you'll be utilizing informal and formal assessments to assess youth status, triage cases to that school's designated staff member, and then follow the school's standard procedures from there. And the third is to install evidence-based interventions with a continuum that matches presenting problem to the students impacted. A challenge might be in that clear identification. It's challenging. Students aren't always forthcoming. There is a sense of shame or fear or stigma around forced prostitution, control of the trafficker might have. So there's going to be a lot of obstacles often to getting an honest and open answer from someone who's already kind of been manipulated in this pretty severe way. And this may also affect just their overall willingness to even respond to a screening tool. And so sometimes having a positive environment, having the rapport and built with the student is the most pivotal thing in identification. The third tier is intensive intervention and reporting. This is kind of the student who we've done these initial things already. They've shown a lot of risk factors. Some of this informal and formal reporting has been done, and there's a pretty serious concern that DMST is going on. It's designed to address a small portion of students who have these intensive needs and need that individualized response for safety, for intervention. So in the context of DMST intervention, a youth who's identified as victimized should be reported immediately to child welfare per your state's mandated reporting requirements, and then follow your school-based protocol. But it's important for the safety of the student that you kind of follow a very tiered, stepwise process. First is doing a safety check to ensure that they're safe, even speaking with school staff member or human trafficking support personnel. You don't know if someone's listening in, if the trafficker is another student at the school, or is a trafficker is using another student at the school to spy. So there could be a lot of circumstances in which the student's safety really needs to be ensured. And often that means pulling them into a private room, but ensuring even that is done safely. If the student doesn't look comfortable, forcing them into responding is not going to be helpful for you and not helpful for the student. Other dimensions could be to ensure if anyone's watching, listening, calling, or texting them really regularly, if the trafficker appears to be nearby, or the student says, you know, the trafficker knows where I live or go to school. If there are cited repercussions, if the student leaves the trafficker. So if the danger is assessed to be urgent or immediate, you should go ahead and call 911 and law enforcement. That's another reason that relationship with law enforcement, where they know that school may be coming to them, is really important. And then, of course, making a report to child welfare services. The last kind of wraparound part of this is some youth may return to school settings as survivors of trafficking, and they often need additional mental health services in order to cope or process traumatic experiences. And it's advisable that these youth are connected to community-based mental health. It's almost always needed. They're often poly-victimized individuals who've experienced a variety of different types of trauma. And it's great that they're receiving support in school, but we really need to get them connected to community-based mental health as well. You'll see a lot of children's advocacy centers in your area that provide free services for youth who've been victimized and systems involved. So that's a really great place to start. But any other community mental health providers that you have a relationship with could be great. And then the school working in conjunction with those providers and these MTSS teams in order to actually provide kind of holistic care to the student is really helpful. And then connecting students to other sources of support, whether they're coming from tiers 1 and 2, so not just students that are kind of identified to be victimized. And lastly, schools can provide wraparound services to youth, such as remedial services, regular check-ins with a school-based mental health professional if they can't get external services, or any other services that are available in your area. Oh, I should say tier 3, apologies for the typo. So recommendations and challenges here is that report suspected DMST to local child welfare services and or law enforcement if needed. You're welcome to call the National Human Trafficking Hotline for information, to provide resources, and then provide school-based mental health intervention integrated with the school's MTSS, making sure we're providing those wraparound services and referrals. A challenge being somewhat obvious, but it's extremely important that student safety is taken into account before you start intervening, asking questions, reporting, make sure they're safe. And then trafficking can occur in schools, so it's important that a safe private place within that school is identified ahead of time. Sorry to run into your time, Jordan. Very last slide. Just remembering that after learning about DMST in schools, students and staff can take on the responsibility of sharing information with peers and across school districts. Like the more people know, the better. We're going to bring something that's super dark and shed some light on it. So one positive outcome might be an increase in reported sex trafficking. And despite that being counterintuitive, that's actually really great. It means that this hidden crime is now kind of more obvious and higher reporting is occurring. So our final statement on this is it's important that light is brought into the darkness and survivors are identified and given the direct help they need. While resiliency is vital for survival, resiliency is not static. And our brief, of course, as Mark mentioned, can be found online. I'm going to pass it off to Jordan. These are just some resources and you have the file as well if you need it, just references as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Nikisa. I hope everybody can hear me okay. Just to remind you who I am, my name is Jordan Brantley, and I am one of the school-based mental health therapists here at the Greenville Mental Health Center in Greenville, South Carolina. And as a member of our school-based team, I'm placed at one of our schools in Greenville County School District full-time, where I work with students and their families there who are also clients of ours through the Mental Health Center. So I'm going to be talking about Greenville County as a whole and also our school district to highlight a case example of how DMST is impacting our area, and also some of the interventions and strategies that are already in place and some of the needs we still have. So just to give you an overview of Greenville County as a whole, population estimates in July of 2019 were 523,542. And this was a significant increase from the previous census back in April of 2010. In fact, it increased by 16%. And in preparation for this presentation, when I was looking up these rates, Greenville County still has an annual population increase rate of right around 2%. So it's going up quick, so quick, in fact, that Greenville, South Carolina has been ranked in the top 10 fastest growing cities in the entire country. So one of the things that makes that really difficult for Greenville County is we are between two hotspots for human trafficking as a whole. Those being Atlanta, Georgia, and Charlotte, North Carolina. In fact, Greenville is almost an exact midpoint between these two. We are very close to being an exact midpoint if you were going to map it out. Atlanta, Georgia, if you don't know, has either been the top ranked or at least in the top 2 for reported human trafficking in the past few years. It is the hot spot for human trafficking right now. And Charlotte, North Carolina has previously ranked in the top 10 cities in the country, and it still has very prevalent rates as well. What makes that bad for us is we are an exact midpoint, and we have the I-85 corridor that connects us, which makes for very easy transporting of people being trafficked across state lines between these hotspots. So what about Greenville County schools? Well, we're pretty large as well. We have 101 different schools and learning programs and centers in our school district. And we have over 76,000 students actively enrolled from pre-K to K-12. there's so many students that it makes us the largest in South Carolina and the 44th largest school district nationally. Now, Charleston and us are pretty much neck and neck. So any given year, Charleston may be ranked as the largest. We kind of leapfrog each other. But prior to this presentation, from what I could find, we are still ranked as the largest school district in the state. Another thing to note about our school district is we have a very large Hispanic population, and a portion of them are undocumented immigrants. And as Nikisa said earlier, one of the risk factors for people who are trafficked is someone being an undocumented immigrant. A lot of times they're lured over here through the promise of better employment or better healthcare for family, overall improvement of life. And that is when they can be trapped in situations like human trafficking. To give you an example, the school I'm placed at, Tanglewood Middle School, has over an 80% minority enrollment rate. Over 40% of that 80% is Hispanic students. And we get people from all over the world, from Guatemala, from Puerto Rico, from Mexico, Honduras, you name it. And a portion of our students are either undocumented themselves or they have an immediate family member who is undocumented. The reason that poses such a risk is because these families are scared to report anything, because then the person they're reporting on could turn them over to immigration, or it could just be discovered naturally throughout the investigation. And so a lot of times they feel like they have to be quiet about it because there's a lot of risk involved for them. So what about human trafficking? How does it impact Greenville and South Carolina overall? According to the Attorney General's office, their annual human trafficking report for 2020 that was released in January of this past year, there were 139 reported cases that involved 179 victims. Now, this is a decrease from the previous year when there was, I think, around 150 something is what it was. So it dropped by about 20. But the thing to note is COVID was very prevalent, as we all know, and schools shut down for a large portion of 2020. Some businesses shut down for a large portion. And like Nikisa said earlier, this allowed traffickers to hide more in the shadows. They were able to do things like move people across state lines and not be as caught. School teachers weren't there to notice signs of abuse and neglect and make reports. So COVID really complicated those reporting numbers for everyone. Greenville County in our state was actually the third highest county in terms of reported rates in all of South Carolina. And in previous years, we were the highest rated county. So it's a very prevalent issue here for us. In January of 2021, there were 75 charges still pending in South Carolina state courts. And those charges consisted of 22 different defendants, and all of them were sex trafficking related charges. So this is one of those issues where even just one reported case is far too many. But you see how prevalent it is in our state and also in Greenville County in particular. But Greenville County is using some very helpful community partnerships to try to combat this issue. I wanted to highlight some of them. If you're curious, you can look up the Attorney General Office Human Trafficking Annual Report. They have a whole section that is pages long of different community partnerships across the state that highlight what those partnerships do. So the first one is GreenLink. GreenLink is Greenville County's transit authority, and they've been using a grant fund from the Federal Transit Administration to sort of do a public awareness campaign. So they have been posting information about human trafficking, warning signs, things to look out for, resources you can have access to if you know someone who may be currently being trafficked. And they're posting this information on the ad spaces on buses, inside of buses, at stop shelters for buses. And they've also been providing educational videos to all their drivers that highlight warning signs of abuse and human trafficking as well. Another community partner we have here is Jasmine Road. Jasmine Road is actually South Carolina's first 2-year residential program for adult women survivors of human trafficking, prostitution, and addiction. And people can apply for their program, and when they are accepted, they have a ton of resources they have access to through there. They have a residential program where they can get residential stay while they're recovering. They have healthcare, dental, continuing education, access to therapy resources, you name it. It is a very comprehensive resource. Another community partner is Switch SC. So Switch SC is a community partner that uses a variety of programs to combat this issue. Some of the things they do are they have a public awareness program where they actually do educational presentations to local agencies and partners. I think they did around 68 awareness programs in 2020, 24 of which were to youth programs with people between the ages of 12 and 18. Like Nakisa mentioned in the presentation earlier, the age range of 12 to 14 has one of the highest rates. In fact, the highest rate, I think, was mentioned for adolescents getting recruited into human trafficking. So Switch SC is hitting that demographic hard with public awareness. Another thing they do is an intervention program where they actually go into environments that are higher risk for people who are being trafficked to provide them with education about the topic, and as well as education regarding resources in their area that they have access to that they might not be aware of. One of the examples that they give on their website is strip clubs. They'll go into local strip clubs and provide education to the employees there, the customers, and just do intervention programs on site there. So those were just a few of the community partners, but like I said, the Attorney General report has way more if you are curious and you want to look into it. So what about Greenville County schools? That was Greenville County as a whole, but what about our school district? What are some of the trainings and partnerships we are using to try to combat this issue? Well, we have annual required trainings on trauma, those adverse childhood experiences that Nakisa referenced earlier, the ACEs, is what we call it for short. They also have annual trainings on signs of abuse and neglect for staff. All of our staff, in accordance with South Carolina law, are mandated reporters. So they know how to make those reports and who to make them to if they notice any of these signs. And trauma and signs of abuse and neglect are indicators of potential human trafficking. Community partnerships that we have, there are several, but I wanted to highlight some of the big ones and some of the ones that are more prevalent across our entire school district. So Prisma Health is our hospital system here, and they have, as a part of a grant-funded middle school initiative called On Track Greenville, which I'll get to On Track more in just a minute. They have opened school-based health clinics at a few of the middle schools in our district where nurse practitioners and registered nurses can go to see students and their families on site at the schools. This is great for a variety of reasons because it removes the barrier of transportation. It gives them more ease of access overall to these resources, and they provide preventive and primary health care. Another partnership we have is the Greater Greenville Mental Health Center, where I am employed. So like I said, our school places therapists full-time at every single program and school in Greenville County schools. We have a very, very comprehensive program that allows for us to be on site as well and remove that barrier of transportation. And we can provide therapy services on site at the schools for kids and their families. Once they are interested, they just sign up for us through an intake process, and then we provide therapy services on site for them there. Another community partner we have is local law enforcement. So the Greenville County Police Department places school resource officers, or SROs for short, at our middle and high schools. And the SROs provide education to staff on juvenile justice, substance abuse, school safety protocols. They also serve as a very positive community mentor. Our SRO, for example, does a really good job of building relationships with the students and just being visible in the hallways and asking people how they're doing. A lot of our students may not have personal experience with law enforcement, or they may be basing their opinions on law enforcement from stuff they've seen in the media or opinions of family member and friends who did have poor experiences from law enforcement. So it really goes a long way towards building those healthy relationships with local law enforcement while they're still young. Another partner we have is Communities and Schools of South Carolina. So Communities and Schools of South Carolina is an affiliate of a national nonprofit agency, and they are at 5 schools in Greenville County, 3 full-time and 2 part-time. And what they do there is they have site coordinators who work with students to identify barriers to success in a variety of areas. Could be social performance, academic, healthcare, you name it. And they work with the students on coming up with strategies to overcome these barriers and get them more integrated into other community resources, such as the other ones I talked about here, to help them meet the needs there and set them up better for success. Now, On Track, I mentioned this earlier about Prisma Health being a part of the On Track Greenville initiative. On Track is a program that's being rolled out in our district-wide. And we have an On Track team that meets at least a couple times a month to discuss students who are flagging in a variety of areas. Those main areas are behaviors, academics, and attendance. Now, we know that school performance is also a possible indicator of human trafficking. So students who are flagging in any of these areas get brought up in meetings. The teams consist of administrators, teachers, community partners such as myself, or representatives from the other community agencies I just discussed. And we talk about what are the needs of the student, what are the barriers, and what are some of the resources and interventions we can set in place to get them back on track for graduation. That's where the name On Track comes from. So it's just a really good team meeting, even if they're not flagging in one of the areas. Teachers can notice potential signs of abuse and neglect, and they can just refer a student to be discussed, and they can also be added to the team agenda. Real quick, because I know we're running short on time here. Rethink SEL is another community resource that we are using. This is pretty new. It's being rolled out district-wide as well. Once it gets up and going full-time, it is a social and emotional learning program that will train staff on how to lead students through a variety of curriculum that teach them about different emotions, different stressors in life, healthy coping strategies they can use to deal with these stressors. Let's see, it also helps them figure out community resources that they may not be aware of that they could get access to if they ever need to talk to somebody about stuff that's going on in their life, like human trafficking or just family conflict in general. So these are all really, really great comprehensive resources in our school that range from tier 1, such as trainings, all the way up to tier 3 intensive community partnerships. That's great, but it doesn't mean everything's perfect. We still have a need for additional resources. And two of the ones that really stood out to me when preparing for this were really specific trainings on human trafficking. We have detailed trainings on signs of abuse and neglect and trauma for all our staff. And those are indicators of potential human trafficking. We know that, and that is great that we train people on that. But there was limited material related to specifically the topic of human trafficking. And I think it could go a long way for staff, parents in the community if there was more of a public awareness campaign that was integrated throughout the schools. We also need more data on school impact. We do know that 12 to 14 is that range where most people are recruited. And we do know how many students are in Greenville County, but there's very limited, easily accessible data on how does the issue of human trafficking specifically impact Greenville County schools. And I'm sure our school district is not the only district where there is limited data on that impact. So those were two of the needs that I saw. I think PBIS obviously could be a really, really great solution to a lot of that, particularly with the specific trainings and everything, integrating that as a tier 1 intervention for all staff. I believe now we are going to turn it back over to Mark and Nikisa for some questions, some Q&A. So Mark, Nikisa?
Yeah, Nikisa, if you don't mind coming back on the camera. We did have a question earlier on the thoughts on the role of social media in all of this. Did we happen to lose Nikisa?
No, I think, am I back?
I can hear you, can't see you, but I can hear you.
Oh. Says start, my video's on.
I can see you, Nikisa.
Okay,
Okay.
awesome. Yeah, so that's a great question. I think we touched a little bit on internet-based versus non-internet-based trafficking. I think, especially for minors, I think that's something we're seeing a big shift of socially, where kids are getting access to internet-based apps, social media earlier, whether it's like Instagram, I should know what the kids these days are using, TikTok, all these different ways of communicating. I think early on we saw a lot more of these chat rooms. That's what the lit will reference often, is this like 90s, 2000s era, like chat room feature, which does still exist. But I think social in-person and social media or internet-based recruitment, they're not finding one is that any more like strong or effective than the others, but there is, I think it would be plausible to see a shift towards more internet-based recruitment, just given the accessibility. And really, I think parents monitoring kids varies so greatly. We don't see parental controls always. We don't see, any of those limitations on accessibility or reviewing kids' phones or digital presence. So I think we're kind of building the ship as we sail it with regards to social media, probably in a lot of domains, but with trafficking as well, I can imagine the interconnection is almost a detriment in that case.
Yeah, and just to kind of add to that, Nikisa, you mentioned it earlier too, how one of the great interventions that would be very effective is more public awareness for parents on how to use different social medias and the risk involved. I know a lot of the families I've worked with personally, they don't really understand Snapchat and TikTok and Instagram. And sometimes that lack of awareness unintentionally puts the kids more at risk, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great point, Jordan. Things like Snapchat, you can add people within a certain geographic area. It's not even, right, people but they're around you, which is extremely dangerous, rather than something like Instagram where someone's often far, you don't really know where that person is. So yeah, I think it's a plausible area of concern, but currently in person is just as dangerous. You saw that some of those points around familial trafficking or intimate partner, those are really common avenues people take or kind of get recruited into trafficking through.
So a couple comments from Stephanie. Many thanks. We must be diligent in awareness on this issue, exclamation. Jennifer, are there specific evidence-based interventions for DSTM that are already delivered in schools? Nikisa, do you want to take a stab at that? I think our conclusion is no. We believe the PBIS framework is the platform for those interventions. But I'm not aware of any specific ones. Are you, Nikisa?
Yeah, we did a pretty hefty lit review, also internet review, because the lit is limited. Things going from practice to research doesn't always happen, so vice versa. And we saw some districts in Florida where the early stages of trying to even address the issue, to Jordan's point, to create materials, to disseminate. We saw some school districts in, I think Texas was the other one, but a lot of these efforts are only coming out of Attorney General's office and legislative branches, and then branching a little bit into like homeless youth serving agencies, like we said, JJ, child welfare. But there isn't currently like a standard, like this is the go-to training that you can use. There's more of this piecemeal, here's a resource. And I think that was a lot of the goal of our brief, was to at least have something to start with. And then we reference a OSS brief, I believe, as well, that has some guidance on trafficking in schools, but isn't necessarily intervention based. It's more like knowledge and understanding and prevention based. So yeah, to answer your question in a long-winded way, there isn't currently any sort of standard that we found, of course, but the internet is vast. So it would be great if there is anything else. I think the more the better at this point.
Yeah, we suspect that this problem is really increasing. Although, Jordan in our conversation earlier was referencing reports may be down, same issue with abuse and neglect. We may see reports down, but actual prevalence is going up. So this is an area really ripe for advancing a research and practice agenda to kind of fill a gap of a critical public health need. I'm sorry, Jordan, I cut you off.
No, you're fine. Those are all great points. I was just going to add, from what I found as well, there seems to be evidence-based responses to the aftermath of DMST, but nothing that was a solid evidence-based intervention as a preventative measure.
So Suzanne says, how would you suggest educating districts about this? I'm in South Carolina. I know Greenville isn't the only district dealing with human trafficking.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I know at least like in the Columbia area where Mark and I at the University of South Carolina are here in this area, I know the Attorney General's office does convene a pretty hefty amount of service providers from this area, including children's advocacy centers, including juvenile justice. And I believe Richland 1 and 2, which are some of our major school districts, have representation in those meetings as well. So I really think some of it just starts with bringing the issue up in these meetings. I've actually started disseminating our brief to some of the children's advocacy centers in our area because they were asking similar questions. How do we help schools do this, and how do we start this process? But bringing it up as an issue and citing some of these numbers and walking into the practice brief is always helpful, because you could say, here's something concrete we can do. It's not just pointing at the problem, which is currently what all we can do because there wasn't much out there. But yeah, I think a lot of it is just bringing it to the table to see what the awareness of other collaborations and committees are. And then linking up with local task forces is also a huge start because they're spearheading a lot of these efforts in municipalities and then statewide as well. There's always a statewide task force as well as specific ones to metropolitan areas.
So I'll raise a question, Nikisa and Jordan, your comments highlighted that we really need cross-system collaboration. We've made progress, right? So we have an interconnected system framework for school mental health and PBIS. So we've seen progress between the education mental health system sort of joining forces, but we have child welfare and justice, and the kids that are in those systems are in our schools. But it feels, and it may be children at risk for this problem may be particularly likely to be in those systems. I believe you highlighted that, Nikisa. But we continue to struggle with those collaborations with those systems. Any ideas on that?
Yeah, I think human trafficking has been swept under the rug because it's not that fun to talk about. It's hard to tangibly do something about it. So there are easier problems, I think, and easier in quotes. Of course, they're all challenging. But I know locally I was engaged with some youth and transition committees, and those are often dealing with runaway and homeless youth. And at those committee meetings, we saw juvenile justice there, just right next to school districts, right next to child welfare. And I really think creating coalitions like that is really the start, not to necessarily add more meetings to everyone's calendar, but to create some of that cross-system collaboration. Because I saw it happening there with runaway and homeless youth, and it is a very similar population. They all shared the population. And I think it's the same mentality of like, wait a minute, this is something that affects all of us. And us all sitting at the table is what it's going to take to collaborate would be great. I was thinking about Jordan's example in Greenville and his school of connecting with law enforcement and how awesome that is to have these other avenues to connect with law enforcement and ways to show positive, healthy relationships so students can reach out for help if they needed it from that resource officer. So sometimes I think it's the visual of having supports in schools, like with law enforcement, but also just being in the same place, like making time to value trafficking and as a community deciding that it's something worth putting another meeting on the calendar for.
Yeah, I think you highlighted, Nikisa, that schools are often the largest youth serving system in a community.
Right.
So we can develop these sort of school-centric strategies, but at times really we need emissaries, leaders, staff from the schools to join with these other community efforts where we may find more energy, for example, for this particular problem. Yeah, so Jennifer says our interconnected system framework model includes human services, not juvenile justice yet, unless you consider truancy officers. I think it's a big issue for the field in general. Also, with the interconnected system framework, we have the district community leadership team, which should be, a diverse group of all the community stakeholders: education, mental health, child welfare, justice, families, primary care, et cetera, coming together to drive this agenda. It seems like we need a lot of work in really empowering those DCLTs to be more effective.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is a willingness to talk about this stuff. It's hard, it's uncomfortable, and it is something I think as a society, especially domestically in the US, we view it as this like international issue, couldn't be happening on my cute neighborhood, but the reality is it's everywhere, and it's just the face changes and looks different. And so I think part of it is reducing that stigma so that victims come forward, so that we prevent victimization and that we can actually intervene by talking about it and making it something as addressable as child homelessness and runaway youth. It's something that people seem more willing to talk about. So yeah, destigmatizing, absolutely.
So we're almost out of time. I'll raise one more issue. I think you guys did a great job of highlighting indicators that you may see in a student that may be at risk for trafficking or being trafficked. So, at tier 1, kind of the global education of the school community around what to be looking for is important. But also this issue of screening. We know that mental health issues in youth are dramatically elevated given the pandemic and other societal stressors that we're dealing with. So screening in and of itself is being elevated. And it would seem like screening for emotional behavioral challenges, trauma, very important for this particular group of students. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, go ahead, Jordan. I've been yammering.
No, I was going to say absolutely screening for sure. One of the things our school district has started doing is a general screening for possible symptoms of depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, things that are potential indicators for human trafficking. What we've noticed in our program through the Greenville Mental Health Center, our school-based team, is referrals have skyrocketed, program high. I mean, we are swamped with referrals because a lot of students who maybe didn't externalize those symptoms, they didn't show it through their behaviors. Maybe they're more introverted, so they just kind of stay quiet. It's easy for them to fall through the cracks and go unidentified. And so now you hand them this screener and they're filling it out. And you're like, whoa, I didn't know little Johnny was severely depressed. And so screening has been a very effective tier 1 intervention for our school. And we've seen referrals go up countywide because of that.
Yeah, we have a study where we saw screening jump from 10% to 28% of the student body pre-pandemic. Jennifer brings up that it's a challenging agenda now with politics and other pushback that may be experienced. Unfortunately, we got to end on that note. Thank you so much, Nikisa, Jordan, for your excellent presentation. A reminder to do the evaluation. Thank you all for joining today, and I hope you have a wonderful time at the rest of the amazing sessions that we have here in the PBIS Leadership Forum. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.